Hey guys, welcome aboard to Just Sleep Stories. Tonight, we are setting sail for waters that are, well, let's just say considerably warmer than anything a medieval peasant ever waded through. Tonight, we're talking about prostitutes in Edo, Japan. And before you do anything else, like subscribe, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always somehow 2 a.m. and somehow always someone's third glass of wine. But only if you actually enjoy what I do here. No pressure, just vibes. Because tonight we're going somewhere very specific, very far away, and very, very human. Let's take a breath and settle in. Let the day go. Whatever happened today, the emails, the commute, the passive-aggressive text from your mother, none of it matters right now. Right now, you're here. And here is a lot more interesting. Because have you ever wondered what it actually meant to be a woman in Edo, Japan? Not the version from the paintings, all silk and lantern light and elegant silence. The real version. The version with cold floors and complicated contracts and a business structure so elaborate it would make your HR department weep with envy. Did these women have days off? Did they have favourites? Did they get tired of the music? Could they quit? Did anyone ever fall genuinely, stupidly, inconveniently in love, and then have to do paperwork about it? What did you eat when your whole life was performance? What did you wear when the outfit was the job? What happened when you got old in a world that only wanted you young? And what on earth did you do when a client started writing poetry about you and wouldn't stop? These are the questions, and tonight, slowly, gently, we are going to answer all of them. Because congratulations, you've just woken up in Edo, Japan. The year is somewhere in the 17th century. The city is enormous, loud, and smells like lacquer, fish broth, and ambition. You have just arrived at the gates of the Yoshiwara, the most famous, most regulated, most strangely beautiful red light district in human history. You don't have a map. You don't speak the language. And someone is already playing a shamisen somewhere nearby, which is either welcoming or deeply ominous depending on your mood. Good luck. Let's start at the beginning, which is less of a building and more of a demographic crisis. Edo, the city we now call Tokyo, was one of the largest cities on Earth by the 18th century, swollen to over 1 million people and absolutely bursting at the seams with men. Specifically, samurai, labourers, merchants, craftsmen, and government workers who had followed the Tokugawa shogunate to its new capital and left their wives and families far behind in distant provinces. The ratio of men to women in Edo at certain points was something like 3-1, and if you know anything about large groups of lonely men with disposable income and absolutely nothing to do on a Friday night, you already know where this is going. The Tokugawa shogunate had unified Japan in 1600 after a long period of civil war, and it had done so with remarkable efficiency and considerable rigidity. The new capital of Edo was the administrative heart of the country, and maintaining it required an enormous permanent population of officials, soldiers and support workers, almost all of them male. The Sankin-kotai system, which required feudal lords to spend alternating years in Edo and their home provinces, meant that thousands of samurai retainers lived in the city for extended periods without their families. They ate in Edo, they drank in Edo, they got bored in Edo. And boredom, when combined with a sword and a small stipend, has historically required management. The merchant class added another layer entirely. Edo was also a commercial city, growing fast and generating money at a rate that made the old social hierarchies increasingly awkward. The samurai sat at the top of the official social structure, above farmers, above craftsmen, above merchants, and yet the merchants were often the ones with actual money. They built shops and warehouses and counting houses. They accumulated wealth that the social order told them was slightly embarrassing, and then they spent it, enthusiastically and creatively, on the things that official society told them were indulgent: theatre, art, food, fashion, and the Yoshiwara, This was the culture of the floating world, ukiyo, a concept that captured something specific about Edo life. The idea that ordinary existence was temporary, shifting, and therefore best experienced fully while you had the chance. The floating world was not a geography, it was a philosophy. It said, life is brief, pleasure is real, and the moment you're in right now is the only one you are guaranteed. It was, in many ways, a completely reasonable response to a society that had been defined by decades of war and still sat under the constant low hum of military authority. When you live under a government that controls everything from your travel to your social rank to the fabric you're permitted to wear, the floating world becomes the only place where something like freedom feels imaginable. And the Yoshiwara was the floating world made physical. It was the place you went when the rest of Edo, with its rules and its hierarchies and its paperwork, became too much to bear for an evening. Every class of man went there. Samurai in plain clothes with their swords left at the gate. Merchants in their finest and most technically prohibited fabrics. Artisans saving up for months for a single visit. Inside the walls, the usual social order relaxed. Money spoke more clearly than rank. A wealthy merchant could sit in a room where a minor samurai could not afford the tea. That kind of inversion was intoxicating, and the shogunate, which understood that concentrating vice in one regulated, taxable, monitorable location was smarter than pretending it didn't exist, allowed it. So this is where the Yoshiwara came from. Not from cruelty alone, though cruelty was certainly present. Not from licentiousness alone, though that was present too. It came from a city of 1 million people, half of them lonely, many of them wealthy, all of them looking for somewhere to put the feelings that the official world had no forms for. The Yoshiwara was the answer Edo gave itself. Whether it was a good answer is a different question entirely. Before you go any further, let's clear something up, because whatever image is forming in your head right now is probably wrong. The Yoshiwara was not a shadowy back-alley operation. It was not hidden. It was not shameful, at least not officially. It was a licensed, government-regulated, walled pleasure district established in 1618, relocated after a catastrophic fire, and rebuilt, with notable improvements, in 1657. It had gates. It had guards. It had rules so elaborate and specific they would have filled a modern compliance handbook, and it had a name, Yoshiwara. Loosely translated, the Reed Plain. Later reinterpreted with considerable dark humour as the Good Luck Plain. Whether the luck was yours depended entirely on which side of the gate you were on. The original Yoshiwara was established at the request of, and this is either impressive or deeply uncomfortable depending on your disposition, a man named Shoji Jinamon, a former brothel keeper who petitioned the shogunate for permission to create a single licensed district that would consolidate the city's existing scattered brothels into one manageable, taxable, controllable location. The shogunate said yes, because the shogunate was very good at recognizing when someone was offering to do their administrative work for them. The result was a walled compound entered through a single gate. One way in, one way out. This was framed as a safety measure, a moral boundary, a way of containing the floating world so it didn't leak into the respectable one. And in practical terms, it did function that way. Women inside the Yoshiwara were not legally permitted to leave without authorization. Men who visited left their real names and social identities at the gate, at least in theory. Inside, different rules applied. The main street, the Nakanosho, was lined with tea houses and the grand facades of the larger establishments, called okiya or okiya, where the higher-ranked courtesans lived and worked. Side streets branched off with smaller houses and lower-priced establishments. The whole district had a physical logic to it. Wealth and prestige concentrated at the centre, diminishing as you moved toward the edges, like any other real estate market, except the product being sold was considerably more complicated. There were shops inside, there were food stalls, there were hairdressers and clothing merchants and people whose entire livelihood consisted of supplying the Yoshiwara with the goods and services it needed to keep running. It was, in this sense, a small city within a city, with its own economy, its own social calendar, its own festivals and ceremonies and seasonal rituals. In spring, the cherry trees along the Nakanocho bloomed, and people came from all over Edo just to walk beneath them. Not everyone who entered the Yoshiwara gate was there for the women. Some came for the atmosphere alone, for the tea houses, for the feeling of being somewhere that operated by different rules. It looked, from certain angles, almost festive. Lanterns hung from every eave. Music drifted through the wooden screens. Women in extraordinary clothing were visible through the latticed lower windows of the grander houses, which is where the name for those window displays came from. The koshi, the lattice, through which a potential client could observe and a courtesan could be seen. It was a display. It was meant to be one. The whole Yoshiwara was a display, an elaborate, beautiful, meticulously maintained display built on a foundation that did not bear looking at too carefully. Here is the part nobody in the pretty woodblock prints mentions. The women of the Yoshiwara did not, by and large, choose this life the way you might choose a career path or a college major. Most arrived through one of several routes, all of which can be summarized as follows: poverty, debt, or someone else's decision made on their behalf. Daughters were sold by families who had nothing left to sell. Girls were handed over by parents who framed it as a sacrifice for the household, which was technically true and emotionally devastating in equal measure. Some came from the countryside with no idea what awaited them. Some came from other districts where things had gone badly, and a very few, were the children of women already inside, born into the system before they were old enough to understand it. The most common route was straightforward economic desperation. Edo period Japan had a rigid agrarian base that was vulnerable to famine, flood, and the crushing weight of taxation. When a farming family faced ruin, and they faced it often, because the margin between survival and catastrophe was thin, and the weather did not care about your feelings, daughters were a resource that could be converted into cash. Not sons, generally. Sons would inherit, would work the land, would carry the family name. Daughters were, in the cold arithmetic of survival, expendable in a way that sons were not. A family would approach a broker, and there was an entire professional class of brokers who operated in this space, who would evaluate the girl, negotiate a price, and arrange the contract. The family received a lump sum. The girl received a new address and a debt she would spend years attempting to pay off. The transaction was legal. It was documented. It was recorded in the kind of careful administrative handwriting that suggests a society deeply committed to orderly paperwork, even when the contents of that paperwork were devastating. Girls typically entered the system young, sometimes as children, in which case they worked initially as junior attendants called kamuro, small figures in miniature versions of courtesan clothing, who followed senior women around and learned, by watching, what their future was going to look like. They ran errands, they carried things, they memorized the etiquette, they grew up inside the walls, which meant that by the time they were old enough to understand what the Yoshiwara was, they had already been inside it long enough that the outside world had become abstract and distant. Girls who arrived as teenagers faced a different kind of disorientation. They came from lives that had context, a village, a family, a way the world was organized, and arrived somewhere that looked, on the surface, extraordinary and felt underneath, like a very comfortable trap. The clothing was finer than anything they had ever worn. The food was better than anything they had eaten. The building was larger than anything they had lived in, and none of it belonged to them. What is worth saying, and worth sitting with, is that the women inside the Yoshiwara were not passive. They had varying degrees of agency within a system that had been designed to minimize it. Some negotiated, some built alliances, some accumulated small savings in ways the house officially discouraged and practically tolerated. Some became genuinely powerful within the district's own hierarchy. The system was cruel, but the women inside it were not simply victims. They were people, complicated, resourceful, sometimes funny, sometimes furious, navigating an architecture of constraint with whatever tools they had, which makes the whole thing not simpler, but considerably more human. At the very peak of the Yoshiwara's elaborate social hierarchy sat a woman called the oiran, and if you have seen any image of a woman in Edo Japan wearing an impossibly ornate kimono, her hair piled into an architectural marvel held together by what appears to be a small forest's worth of lacquered pins, walking in platform shoes so tall she required 2 attendants just to remain upright. That was her. The oiran was not simply a prostitute. She was, by the standards of her world, a celebrity, an artist, a cultural institution, and an extremely expensive evening out. Getting an audience with a top-ranked oiran was harder than getting a table at the most exclusive restaurant in the city, and significantly more paperwork. The word oiran itself is thought to derive from the phrase oira no tokoro no nesan, roughly, the older sister of our house, which is either charming or deeply ironic depending on your feelings about the institution it describes. By the Middle Edo period, the term had come to refer broadly to the higher-ranking courtesans of the Yoshiwara, distinguishing them from the lower-tier workers whose circumstances were considerably less glamorous and considerably less optional. What made an oiran was not simply beauty, though beauty was certainly part of the calculation. It was accomplishment. It was presence. It was the particular quality of making a man feel, for the duration of an evening, that he was the most interesting person in the world. A skill that is harder than it sounds and takes considerably longer to develop than any of the more obvious ones. An oiran needed to be able to play the shamisen with genuine skill. She needed to be able to compose a poem in response to one sent by a client without taking so long that the moment passed. She needed to be able to conduct the tea ceremony, to dance, to discuss literature, to manage the elaborate social rituals of the Yoshiwara without ever appearing to be managing them. She also needed to know how to refuse. This was, counterintuitively, one of the most important skills she possessed. The right to refuse a client, to decide that a particular man was not worth her time regardless of his money, was one of the few genuine powers available to a top-ranked oiran, and the best of them used it with considerable precision. A woman who accepted everyone was worth nothing in particular. A woman who was selective, who had standards, who had turned away 3 merchants and a minor lord before agreeing to receive you, was worth an enormous amount. The refusal was part of the product. The life was also, by any objective measure, exhausting. The ceremonies surrounding a high-end engagement were not brief. An evening with an oiran involved multiple courses of food, extensive ritual drinking, musical performance, conversation, and the performance of a particular kind of effortless grace that took enormous effort. And then there was the next morning, and the day after that, and the week after that. The oiran was always on. The performance had no real backstage. She was in some ways the most visible woman in Edo, her image printed on wood blocks and sold across the city, her hairstyles copied, her name known, and simultaneously one of the most constrained. She could not leave the Yoshiwara without permission. She could not choose her clients entirely freely, though she could refuse them. She could not retire without having her debt cleared. She was a celebrity inside a very beautiful, very well-appointed cage. And the Edo period, which had a gift for these kinds of arrangements, found the whole thing entirely normal. If you thought your workplace had a confusing org chart, wait until you hear about the Yoshiwara's ranking system, which was so specific, so layered, and so ruthlessly enforced that it would have made a medieval guildmaster weep with admiration. At the top were the taiyu, the most elite courtesans, so exclusive by the early Edo period that their fees were practically mythological and their availability practically non-existent. Below them came the koshi, then the subone, then ranks descending in prestige and price all the way down to the lower-tier workers who had far fewer choices and far less agency. Every rank came with its own clothing requirements, its own protocols, its own way of doing business. Getting promoted was possible. Getting demoted was quieter, but equally real. The taiyu of the early Yoshiwara were, in a very literal sense, untouchable. Not in the spiritual sense, but in the practical one. Their fees were so high that even wealthy men might spend several years' income on a single extended engagement. The process of actually seeing a taiyu involved multiple preparatory visits, substantial gifts, the correct behaviour at each stage, and the real possibility that she would decide at any point that you were not worth continuing with. By the mid-Edo period, the taiyu had become so expensive and so elaborate that the rank had essentially priced itself out of existence. The last taiyu retired in the early 18th century, and the oiran took their place at the top of the hierarchy. Glamorous, but slightly more accessible, which tells you something useful about the economics of exclusivity. Below the upper ranks, the system became more pragmatic and considerably less poetic. The middle-tier courtesans had contracts, clients, and a degree of professional autonomy, though less than their senior counterparts. They might specialise. Some were known particularly for their music, some for their conversation, and they built reputations that functioned as their primary professional asset. A woman with a good reputation could negotiate. A woman without one could not. The lower ranks were harder. Women in these tiers worked in smaller establishments, received less training, had fewer options, and operated in conditions that the Yoshiwara's more polished public face was designed to obscure. These were the women who had come in with the least leverage and accumulated very little. Their debt tended to be more persistent, their circumstances more precarious, their ability to refuse clients far more limited. Rank was indicated visually in ways the entire city could read at a glance. The number and style of kanzashi, the ornamental pins worn in the hair, signalled a woman's status. The way her obi was tied told you what category she fell into before she said a word. The fabric of her kimono, the number of layers, the specific colours and patterns, all of it was a coded language that anyone in Edo could decode without instruction, because the Yoshiwara was so embedded in the city's visual culture that its semiotics had become common knowledge. It was, in a way, the most legible hierarchy in Edo. At a time when social rank elsewhere in the city was sometimes obscured, merchants wearing plain clothes to avoid sumptuary law violations, samurai in disguise when they visited entertainment districts, the Yoshiwara put rank on the outside of the body in silk and lacquer and deliberate display. "Here is what I am worth," the clothing said. "Here is what it will cost you to be in my presence. Here is exactly where I stand in an order that has been very carefully designed to make sure everyone knows where they stand." That kind of clarity is almost comforting, until you think about what enforced it. Let's talk about money, because money is where this story gets particularly grim and particularly clever all at once. When a girl entered the Yoshiwara, she came with a debt, the sum her family had been paid, plus the cost of her training, her clothing, her food, her lodging, and a rotating collection of fees and charges that the house helpfully kept track of for her. This debt was the mechanism by which the whole system ran. In theory, a woman could work off her debt and buy her freedom. In practice, the debt had a way of growing. New kimono needed for a client meeting added to the debt. Medicine when she fell ill added to the debt. A fee for a special festival the house put on added to the debt. It was less a financial arrangement and more a philosophical position on the nature of owing. The kimono situation alone was enough to make the whole thing circular. A high-ranking courtesan was expected to have an extensive wardrobe. Not just any wardrobe, an exceptional one, because she was, among other things, a walking advertisement for the house. The fabrics had to be right, the dyeing correct, the seasonal appropriateness impeccable. New seasons required new garments. Important clients warranted specific outfits. And all of this clothing, this professionally necessary, contractually required, non-negotiable element of the job, was charged to the woman wearing it. It is the kind of arrangement that would get a modern employer into very serious legal trouble, and in Edo Japan it was simply how things worked. The houses that operated within the Yoshiwara, the okiya, the brothel houses that employed and housed the women, ran as businesses, which they were, with all the unsentimental accounting that implies. They kept ledgers. They tracked what each woman earned and what she owed. They calculated interest, though it was not always framed as interest, because framing it as interest would have made the system look more obviously like a trap than the authorities were comfortable with. It was framed as running costs, as care, as investment in her future. The ledger had different language for the same mathematics. Some women did pay off their debts. The historical record contains these cases, and they matter because they demonstrate the system was not entirely sealed. A woman who was particularly popular, who had reliable clients, who managed to accumulate small savings from the gifts and tips that clients sometimes pressed into her hands in moments of genuine feeling. She might, over years, reach a point where the debt was manageable and then gone. And then she was free, which in practice meant she left the Yoshiwara and tried to construct a life in a world that had very specific and not particularly charitable feelings about where she'd just come from. The contract itself was for a fixed term, typically 10 years in the earlier period, sometimes reduced later. This was the official story. You serve your term, your debt is cleared, you leave. The unofficial story was that 10 years is a long time inside a walled compound, that debts have a way of extending terms, and that the house had more interest in keeping a popular woman working than in releasing her. It was not legally enslaved. It was not chattel. It was something more ambiguous and in some ways more difficult to confront. A system that was almost fair, almost contractual, almost voluntary, and not quite any of those things. Mourning in the Yoshiwara did not arrive the way it arrived for everyone else in Edo. The district ran on its own schedule, its own logic, its own relationship with daylight, which is to say, a fairly indifferent one. While the rest of the city was already hauling fish and hammering nails and opening shops, the Yoshiwara was still quiet, still heavy with last night's incense, still full of women sleeping in rooms that smelled of face powder and cedarwood. You woke up on a futon in a house that was also a business, in a body that was also an asset, and you began the long, painstaking process of transforming yourself into the version of yourself the world was paying to see. The first thing, before anything else, was the face. You had gone to bed with your makeup partially removed, because sleeping in full lead-based white foundation was a one-way road to skin problems even by Edo standards, and a courtesan with ruined skin had a professional problem she could not afford. So the morning began with a fresh application. The white foundation first, worked carefully from a small porcelain dish, applied with a brush or a cloth in smooth strokes that required years of practice to execute without visible lines. Then the rouge, then the lips, painted smaller and more precise than the actual mouth, which is a beauty trick that sounds simple and takes a surprisingly long time to master. Hair came next, or had been dealt with the night before and preserved on a wooden neck pillow. The hairstyles of the Yoshiwara were not things you redid casually every morning. They were structures that, at the higher ranks, might take an hour or more to assemble, and were maintained as long as possible between rebuilding. You ran a comb through carefully. You added oil where it was needed. You checked the pins. In a house with multiple women, there was usually a hierarchy to the mirror. though by this point you had probably learned to get ready largely by touch and memory. Then the kimono, which had been folded the night before with the kind of care that people today reserve for very expensive electronics. The layers went on in sequence, the undergarment first, then the inner kimono, then the outer. Each layer required adjustment. The obi had to be tied correctly, in the front, always, in the Yoshiwara manner, and with the right tension, not so tight you couldn't breathe, but not so loose it looked careless. This took time. At the higher ranks, dressing was not a solo activity. Attendants helped. Junior courtesans learned by watching their seniors dress, the same way an apprentice learns a craft, and the craft in this case was the precise presentation of the body as an object of desire and cultural refinement. Meals were available, and a woman who was not receiving clients in the morning had a few hours that were something close to her own. She might practice the shamisen in a small room, the sound carrying through the walls in a way that created the Yoshiwara's characteristic ambient soundtrack, even in the quiet hours. She might write letters to clients, poems, notes in her own hand that mixed professional necessity with whatever was actually on her mind. She might talk with the other women in the house, which was its own complicated social world, full of hierarchy and alliance and quiet solidarity and occasional fierce competition. And then the day built toward evening, which was when the Yoshiwara came fully to life. Lanterns were lit, the nakanocho filled with people, the tea houses opened, and you were ready, or you appeared to be, which in the Yoshiwara was close enough to the same thing. The kimono of the Yoshiwara was not clothing in any ordinary sense of the word. It was armour, advertisement and artwork simultaneously, and putting it on correctly was a skill that took years to learn and considerable help to execute. A lower-ranked woman might dress herself, or with the help of a single attendant. A high-ranking oiran getting ready for an important evening was at the centre of something closer to a production. Multiple layers of silk, each chosen with intention. An obi, the wide sash at the waist, tied in front rather than the back, which distinguished Yoshiwara women from respectable ones, in a visual shorthand the whole city understood. And the hair! The hair deserves its own segment, which, as it happens, it is about to receive. But first the layers, because the layers matter and because understanding them explains something important about what the kimono in the Yoshiwara was doing. An ordinary woman in Edo might wear 2 or 3 layers on a cold day. A high-ranking oiran might wear 5, 6, 7. Each layer was a different colour, and the colours were chosen to coordinate in specific ways, the edge of one layer visible at the collar or sleeve hem of the next, creating a cascade of colour that was called kasein no irome, the layering of colours. This was not decoration for its own sake, it was a language. Different colour combinations signalled different things: the season, the occasion, the mood, the rank of the wearer, the specific aesthetic identity she'd cultivated. Reading someone's kimono in the Yoshiwara was reading a text. The outer kimono itself was extraordinary. The fabrics used at the upper tiers of the Yoshiwara were the finest produced in Japan, from the workshops of Kyoto that had been making luxury silk for centuries. Yuzen dyeing, which allowed for complex pictorial designs, cranes in flight, maple leaves, waves, chrysanthemums, produced garments that were effectively paintings you could wear. The cost was significant enough that even some very wealthy clients had moments of pause when they saw the accounting. The oiran's wardrobe was worth more than most Edo residents' entire material existence, and it was all debt. Getting dressed for an important evening could take 2 hours. It is worth actually sitting with that. 2 hours of preparation before the evening had even started, every layer placed correctly, every hem at the right length, every colour combination approved and adjusted. The obi tied and retied until it sat exactly right. The footwear selected, the tall koma gita for an oiran doshu procession, or the appropriate alternative for an indoor evening. The final accessories chosen and placed, The fan tucked into the obi, the tobacco pouch if she carried one, the small items whose presence or absence communicated volumes to anyone who knew how to read them. And when it was done, the result was not just beautiful, it was extraordinary in a specific way that the Edo period was extremely good at producing. It was beauty that was also performance, adornment that was also statement, personal expression that was also professional uniform. The woman inside the kimono was not separate from it. She wore it as a musician plays an instrument, the technique invisible, the result appearing effortless, the hours of practice completely concealed. That was the point. The hours of practice always needed to be completely concealed. In Edo Japan, the back of a woman's neck was considered one of the most beautiful and alluring parts of the body, which means the entire project of Yoshiwara hairstyling was, at its core, a very elaborate exercise in neck presentation. The hairstyles worn by courtesans, especially the higher-ranked ones, were extraordinary structures involving real hair, supplemental hair, wax, camellia oil, and enough lacquered pins to build a modest birdcage. They took hours to assemble and were not, under any comfortable circumstances, something you slept on normally. Some women slept on specially shaped wooden pillows designed to cradle the neck while leaving the hair entirely undisturbed. Whether this was restful is a matter historians have politely declined to speculate on. The dominant styles in the Yoshiwara were variations on the shimada, a broad category of upswept hairstyles that had been popular across Japan, but were worn in particular elaborate forms within the district. The Yoshiwara's top-ranked courtesans wore versions that were significantly more complex than what respectable women wore. More volume, more pins, more ornament, taller and more architecturally ambitious in ways that were, again, readable as status signals to the entire city. You could identify a woman's rank from across the street by the shape of her hair before you got close enough to see her face. Camellia oil was the product that held everything together, and it was applied generously enough that the hair had a deep shine that caught the lamplight in a specific way. Another deliberate aesthetic effect in a district where almost every aesthetic effect was deliberate. The oil scented the hair too, a faintly floral, faintly sweet smell that mixed with the powdered white foundation and the incense that burned constantly in the better establishments and became, for anyone who spent time in the Yoshiwara, simply the smell of the place. The kanzashi, the hairpins, were spectacular. At the upper tiers, these were not simple pins. They were works of craft in their own right. Lacquered wood, tortoiseshell, coral, silver, sometimes gold, shaped into flowers and butterflies and willow branches and small hanging ornaments called bira that swayed gently when the woman moved, catching the light. A full set of high-ranking kanzashi could contain dozens of individual pieces. Putting them in correctly was a specific skill. Removing them at the end of the evening, presumably, was a relief. The neck, once all of this was assembled, was the focal point. The hair was swept up and forward, the nape left bare and clean, the collar of the kimono arranged to sit low at the back in the particular way that Yoshiwara women wore it, lower than respectable women, another visual signal in the city's endless dress code semaphore. It was this exposed nape, white with foundation, framed by the sweep of the hair above and the silk collar below, that woodblock print artist returned to again and again. It was considered deeply beautiful. It was also the result of 2 hours of careful assembly, a wooden neck pillow, and the permanent mild anxiety of anyone who has ever tried to sleep without disturbing something they spent a very long time building. Before the kimono, before the hair, before any of it, there was the face. And in the Yoshiwara, the face was everything. The white foundation worn by courtesans, a thick, flawless layer applied with a brush and a great deal of patience, was made, in large part, from lead, which is toxic, which everyone in a position to care about such things did not yet fully understand, which did not make it less toxic, only less discussed. The white was applied from the face down the neck and across the chest, creating the illusion of luminous, perfect skin. Over that went a flush of red, safflower-based rouge at the cheeks and corners of the eye. Then the lips, painted smaller than they actually were, in red or sometimes black for the highest ranks, which sounds alarming and looked, reportedly, extraordinary. The white foundation, oshiroi, was the foundation of the entire Yoshiwara aesthetic in a way that was more than metaphorical. It created a surface. A face transformed by oshiroi was not quite a face anymore. It was closer to a mask, a surface of careful blankness onto which expression could be applied with deliberate intention. The eyebrows were painted on, the natural brows sometimes shaved or covered, the painted versions drawn higher on the forehead, more arched, more controlled. It was beauty as architecture, and the woman who wore it well was the woman who had learned to inhabit the architecture rather than fight it. The red that went over the white beni was made primarily from safflower petals, crushed and processed into a pigment that ranged from pale pink to deep crimson depending on concentration. Applied to the cheeks and the corners of the eyes, it created a flush that the white foundation would otherwise have eliminated. The effect was a face that appeared both flawless and alive, which is a difficult trick to pull off, and one that the women of the Yoshiwara executed every single day of their working lives. The lips were a specific, careful calculation. The fashion of the Edo period dictated a small, precise mouth, lips painted to look smaller than they actually were, with a cosmetic line drawn inside the natural lip line, creating a rosebud effect that was considered the height of refinement. At the very top ranks, lip colour was sometimes painted in black rather than red, a choice that required extraordinary confidence and produced an effect that artists and observers described with consistent reverence. A woman with blackened teeth and black-painted lips was signalling something about her status and her aesthetic authority that had no modern equivalent. It looked nothing like anything you've ever seen, and by all accounts it was stunning. What the lead was doing to the skin underneath all of this was a slower conversation. Chronic lead exposure causes a range of symptoms, fatigue, pain, neurological effects, that in the context of the Yoshiwara would have been attributed to other causes or simply absorbed into the general background of physical difficulty. Some women used the makeup heavily for years. The irony is that the oshiroi was used partly because it made the skin appear so perfect, when its long-term effect was to damage the very skin it was covering. The beauty and its cost, as with so much else in the Yoshiwara, were inseparable. Here is something the sad economics of the Yoshiwara occasionally produced by accident: genuinely accomplished women. Because the higher-ranked courtesans were not simply expected to be available, they were expected to be interesting, entertaining, cultured. A client spending serious money on an evening with a top-tier oiran was not just paying for company. He was paying for conversation, for music, for poetry, for the experience of being in the presence of a woman who could match him intellectually and leave him feeling, however briefly, like someone refined. So girls were trained. In music, the shamisen primarily, a 3-stringed instrument that requires real commitment to play well. In dance, in the tea ceremony, in calligraphy, in the composition of poetry. Some women, by the time they reached the upper ranks, were genuinely extraordinary at several of these things. The training began early. The kamuro, those small attendants who followed senior courtesans around in miniature versions of the same elaborate clothing, were not just decoration. They were apprentices. They watched everything. They were corrected constantly. The way you walked, the way you sat, the way you held a cup, the angle at which you tilted your head when listening, all of it was observed, evaluated, and adjusted. Posture was not a suggestion. Deportment was not optional. The ability to move through a room in extraordinary clothing without appearing to think about the extraordinary clothing was a skill. and it was taught the way all skills are taught, through repetition until it became invisible. The shamisen lesson started young and continued indefinitely, because the shamisen is an instrument that rewards years of practice with something that sounds effortless, and effortlessness was the entire aesthetic goal. You practiced until the calluses on your fingers stopped hurting, and then you practiced more. A woman who played beautifully had a professional asset that was genuinely difficult to replicate and impossible to fake in a room where the client was sitting 3 feet away from you. Bad shamisen playing in the Yoshiwara was career-limiting in a way that is almost funny until you think about how old the student was when the lesson started. Dance training was similarly serious. The dances performed in the Yoshiwara context were drawn from traditions with long histories, precise, codified, technically demanding. A wrong movement was visible. An inexpert performance was distinguishable from a skilled one to anyone who had seen both, and the clients of the upper Yoshiwara had generally seen both. A woman who danced well was valuable. A woman who danced well and played the shamisen, and could compose a passable poem on a seasonal theme and conduct the tea ceremony with correct form was, in the commercial language of the Yoshiwara, exceptional. The tea ceremony deserves particular attention because it captures something important about what the training was really for. The tea ceremony in the Japanese tradition is not about tea. It is about presence, about the creation of a moment of calm, focused attention shared between people in a room together. A woman who had genuinely learned the tea ceremony had learned how to make someone feel that this moment, right now, is the only one that matters. She had learned how to be completely present in a way that made the other person feel completely received. If that sounds like it would be useful in the Yoshiwara's specific professional context, that is because it was. The tea ceremony was not a leisure skill. It was a precision tool for the manufacture of intimacy. What the training produced, in its best outcomes, were women who were more formally educated in the arts than most of the men who came to see them. A merchant who had spent his days in a counting house, a samurai whose intellectual life had been shaped primarily by military protocol. They were sitting across from a woman who had spent years studying music, poetry, dance, and the art of human attention. The Yoshiwara had, by accident or design, created a class of women who were culturally exceptional and professionally constrained simultaneously. That tension never entirely resolved itself, but it produced, on certain evenings in certain rooms, something that looked, from certain angles, almost like equality. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the sound. The Yoshiwara at dusk was a place of deliberate, carefully constructed atmosphere, and music was a central part of that construction. The shamisen, a long-necked, 3-stringed instrument played with a large plectrum, was everywhere. Its sound is hard to describe if you haven't heard it. Plaintive and bright at once, slightly buzzy, carrying an ache in it that suited the Yoshiwara's particular brand of beautiful sadness remarkably well. Women practiced it for hours a day. The sound drifted through wooden screens and paper walls and out into the lantern-lit streets, mixing with the smell of charcoal braziers and the distant sound of the canal. The shamisen had arrived in Japan from the Ryukyu Islands in the mid-16th century, adapted from a Chinese instrument, and had spread through the entertainment districts with remarkable speed, because it turned out to be almost perfectly suited to them. It was portable, it was expressive, it could accompany a voice in a way that felt intimate rather than overwhelming. And it had a quality that musicians and listeners alike described as carrying emotion with unusual directness, as though the space between the string and the ear was shorter than it should be, as though the sound bypassed whatever filter normally sits between music and feeling. In the Yoshiwara, the shamisen was not background music, it was a demonstration. A courtesan who played well during an evening's entertainment was communicating something about herself, her training, her discipline, her capability, at the same time as she was simply playing. The music was never separate from the performance of the self. Everything in the Yoshiwara was both the thing it appeared to be and a signal about the person doing it, and the shamisen was no exception. The styles of music played within the district evolved over the Edo period into their own distinct traditions. Nagauta, long song, developed partly in the context of kabuki theatre and the entertainment districts and became one of the dominant forms of shamisen music associated with the Yoshiwara. It was lyrical, extended, technically demanding, and deeply connected to the emotional vocabulary of the floating world. Longing, impermanence, beauty that knows it won't last. The texts of the songs were often drawn from or explicitly referenced the world of the courtesan, love that couldn't be consummated, partings at dawn, the particular ache of an ending that everyone in the room understood was coming. Listening to the shamisen in the Yoshiwara was not a passive experience. The songs had context, and that context was shared knowledge. A client who heard a particular song being played knew what it was about, knew what emotional register he was being invited into, knew that the woman playing it had chosen this piece for this moment for reasons that were worth paying attention to. The music was conversation. It was one more layer in the elaborate ongoing exchange between performer and audience that the Yoshiwara ran on. And then there was the purely physical dimension of sound filling a wooden building at night. The Yoshiwara's architecture, paper screens, thin wooden walls, open corridors meant that music moved through the space freely, bleeding from one room to the next, layering with other sounds, conversation, laughter, the clatter of dishes, the soft percussion of footsteps on wooden floors. You could be walking down the Nakanocho on a winter evening and hear 3 different shamisen being played in 3 different buildings simultaneously, their melodies overlapping and separating in the cold air. It sounded reportedly like the district itself was singing. Whether that was beautiful or heartbreaking probably depended on where you were standing when you heard it. Coming to the Yoshiwara as a client was not, as it turned out, simply a matter of showing up with money. There was an entire choreography to it, a set of unwritten, and sometimes very written, rules governing how a man was supposed to behave, what he was supposed to say, how he was supposed to dress, and how he was supposed to conduct himself if he wanted to be received with anything other than polite contempt. First-time visitors were not permitted to see a top-ranked courtesan at all. You had to come back, multiple times, pay for the privilege of an introduction, demonstrate that you were worth her attention. It was, in the most perverse possible way, a courtship ritual, one that the woman technically controlled, at least at the upper end of the market. The first visit, the shokai, was effectively a screening. You arrived, you were seated, you were served food and drink, and the courtesan you had expressed interest in was present in the room, but present in the way that a gallery painting is present. Observable, evaluated, not yet accessible. She would not speak to you at length. She would not engage with you in any significant way. You were being looked at as much as you were looking. Were you well dressed? Did you know how to behave? Could you hold a conversation without embarrassing yourself or her? Were you the kind of man worth a second visit? If the first visit was acceptable, and the house's staff were paying close attention to everything, including how much you spent, how you treated the junior staff, and whether you ate your food with appropriate manners, you might be invited to return. The second visit, the yobidashi, was when actual engagement became possible. By the third visit, if everything had gone correctly, a genuine relationship could begin. This 3-visit minimum was not a formality. It was the foundation of the entire upper-tier business model, because a man who had invested 3 evenings and 3 sets of fees before anything of consequence had occurred was a man who was already emotionally and financially committed in ways that made him very useful going forward. The rules around behaviour during an engagement were specific and enforced by the staff with considerable firmness. You did not rush. Rushing was the mark of someone who had misunderstood what he was paying for. You did not discuss money directly. The financial arrangements were handled by the house and settled separately, and bringing them into the room was considered deeply uncouth, the equivalent of reading the receipt aloud at a very expensive dinner. You did not touch anything that had not been offered. You did not ask for things that were not on offer without appropriate preamble. You brought gifts. The gifts were not optional, and they were not small. Seasonal gifts, gifts marking specific occasions, gifts that demonstrated you had been paying attention to what the courtesan mentioned she admired. A man who brought good gifts, thoughtful, well chosen, appropriately expensive, was a man who understood how this worked. A man who arrived empty-handed was a man who would be remembered for it. The gifts, like everything else in the Yoshiwara, were both genuinely meaningful and commercially essential, and the two things coexisted without apparent contradiction. And through all of it, the courtesan maintained what can only be described as supreme composure. She was present, attentive, engaged, warm, and also fundamentally unreachable, in the way that the moon is unreachable while being entirely visible. This quality of being present and distant simultaneously was the thing that the upper Yoshiwara sold above all else, and the clients who kept coming back were the ones who found that combination more compelling than anything more straightforwardly available. It was the oldest sales technique in history. The thing you can almost have is worth more than the thing you have completely. And then, inevitably, it happened. Despite all the rules, all the ceremony, all the careful theatrical distance built into the entire system, a man fell in love, genuinely, helplessly, ruinously in love. It happened with enough frequency that the Edo cultural imagination was absolutely saturated with it. In kabuki plays, in woodblock prints, in novels, in cautionary tales passed around merchant circles like a very specific warning label. The Yoshiwara ran on the performance of intimacy, but sometimes the performance stopped performing and became something real, which was a problem for everyone involved, particularly the man's finances and the woman's contractual obligations. The Edo period had a word for the besotted client, the swicken, or sometimes just the fool who forgot where he was. The cultural literature of the period treated this character with a mixture of sympathy, comedy, and the kind of resigned head-shaking usually reserved for someone who has done something entirely predictable and entirely preventable. Everyone knew what the Yoshiwara was, everyone knew the rules, and yet, with reliable regularity, men walked in knowing perfectly well what was real, and walked out convinced they had found the exception. The mechanism was not mystery. The courtesans of the upper Yoshiwara were skilled at the specific art of making a man feel uniquely seen. Not all men, not every time, but the good ones could identify what a particular client needed to feel and provide precisely that. The lonely merchant needed to feel admired. The ambitious samurai needed to feel understood. The scholar needed to feel that his ideas were interesting to someone beautiful. Whatever the gap was, the skilled courtesan identified it with something close to diagnostic precision and filled it, carefully and consistently across multiple visits. The man who fell in love was not deluded. He was experiencing something real. It simply was not the thing he thought it was. When a man became genuinely attached, returning constantly, spending beyond his means, writing letters and poems that the courtesan received with professional grace, the house's position was complicated. A deeply attached client was an excellent revenue stream right up until the point where his money ran out, at which point he became a liability. The stories that Edo period literature returned to obsessively were the ones about what happened at that turning point. The man who spent his entire family inheritance on a courtesan and then discovered, with devastating clarity, that the warmth he had experienced was part of a service. The rupture of that discovery runs through hundreds of kabuki plays and popular novels of the period, with the consistency of a recurring nightmare. What happened to the woman in these situations was more complicated and less discussed. A courtesan who developed genuine feeling for a client was in a professionally untenable position. Genuine feeling was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was dangerous in a system that offered very little protection. Some women did develop real attachments. Some of those attachments were expressed obliquely, in poems, in the particular quality of attention paid during visits, in small gestures that the client might or might not have recognized for what they were. And some of those attachments became the basis for the love-suicide narratives that Edo theatre kept returning to, stories where the only resolution available to two people trapped by money and contract and social structure was to resolve themselves out of existence entirely. It was, in the end, a system that produced intimacy as a product, and then was surprised, repeatedly and structurally, when intimacy behaved like intimacy rather than a product. The Yoshiwara ran on the distance between the real and the performed. When that distance closed, the machinery stopped working, and the Edo cultural imagination, which understood this perfectly, spent 200 years writing plays about it anyway, because some things are too human to stop being interesting just because you understand how they work. There are parts of the Yoshiwara's history that require a certain matter-of-factness to get through, and this is one of them. The mizuage was the ceremony, and it was framed as a ceremony with all the ritual weight that word implies, marking a young courtesan's first client. It was sold at the upper ranks as an honour, as an event of significance, something to be bid on and celebrated. The reality was the deflowering of a young woman who had not chosen to be there, dressed in extraordinary clothing, in a room full of symbolism designed to frame something exploitative as something sacred. The Edo period had an exceptional talent for making its most uncomfortable arrangements sound, in the right light, almost beautiful. The bidding process for a high-ranking girl's mizuage could be considerable. Wealthy clients competed for the privilege, and the sum eventually paid went to the house, theoretically offset against the girl's debt, though the accounting of this was handled by the house, and the girl had limited visibility into the specifics. The competition itself was framed as a mark of the girl's desirability, which is the kind of framing that requires an enormous amount of cultural architecture to sustain, and the Edo period was architecturally very well equipped. The girl in question was dressed with exceptional care for the occasion. New kimono, full makeup, the most elaborate version of her hair she had yet worn. The preparation was long, and the attention lavished on her appearance was genuine, which is one of those details that sits uncomfortably alongside everything else. The ritual had its own vocabulary, its own sequence of steps, its own aesthetic logic. It was one of the Yoshiwara's most visible ceremonies, and one of the most thoroughly wrapped in the symbolic language of transformation and significance. What the girl herself experienced during this process is not well documented, which is consistent with how the Yoshiwara documented things generally, extensively on the financial side, sparsely on the interior experience of the women involved. We have ledgers and contracts and woodblock prints. We have far fewer first-person accounts. The records we do have from women who wrote about their lives inside the Yoshiwara contain the mizuage mostly as a fact rather than an elaborated experience, noted, recorded, moved past. It is worth sitting with what the ceremony was actually doing, beyond its immediate function. By ritualizing the event, by surrounding it with symbolism and bidding and preparation and the full apparatus of significance. The Yoshiwara was doing what social institutions do, when they need to make something that would otherwise be clearly wrong feel like something else, like passage, like honour, like the natural order of things. The ritual was not incidental to the function. The ritual was the mechanism by which the function was made sustainable, year after year, generation after generation. The clothes and the ceremony and the framing were doing very heavy lifting, and they worked in the sense that the institution persisted for centuries, which is one definition of working and not the most important one. The women of the Yoshiwara got sick. Of course they did. They lived in close quarters, in buildings that were not well ventilated, in a profession that made them physically vulnerable in ways that the lead face paint and the damp winters of Edo only compounded. Sexually transmitted infections, syphilis particularly, which arrived in Japan via trade routes in the 16th century and made itself very much at home, were a constant presence. There were doctors attached to the district. There were remedies, some of them useful, many of them not, a few of them quietly making things worse. A woman who became too ill to work slid down the economic ladder quickly, because a body that could not produce income was a body the house had very limited patience for. Syphilis was the great undiscussed catastrophe of the Yoshiwara. It moved through the district steadily, infecting both the women who worked there and the men who visited, and from the men outward into the broader city and beyond. The Edo period understanding of the disease was incomplete. They knew it was communicable, knew it progressed in stages, did not know the mechanism of transmission with any precision. Treatments existed and ranged from mildly useful to actively harmful. Mercury-based compounds, which did have some effect on the bacteria, were used, but mercury is itself toxic, and treating syphilis with mercury in the Edo period was a transaction between two bad options. Some women took it, some recovered partially, many did not recover at all. The respiratory illnesses that moved through any densely populated wooden building in an Edo winter were a separate, more democratic problem. Tuberculosis, called in the period by various names that gestured at its symptoms without identifying its cause, was common in the Yoshiwara for the same reason it was common anywhere in Edo, where many people lived and slept in close proximity. The buildings were not well heated. The winters were cold and damp. Women whose immune systems were already compromised by overwork, poor sleep, inadequate nutrition, and chronic anxiety were not well positioned to resist it. The doctors who served the Yoshiwara were real doctors, trained in the period's medical traditions, and some of them were genuinely skilled within the constraints of what Edo period medicine knew. But what Edo period medicine knew had limits, and those limits pressed hardest on the women whose health was most at risk. The medical care available to a high-ranking oiran was better than what was available to a lower-tier worker, because everything in the Yoshiwara was stratified by rank. A woman at the bottom of the hierarchy who became ill faced the additional pressure that her illness was also a financial problem for the house, which changed the quality of attention paid to her recovery. What is harder to document, and perhaps more pervasive than any specific disease, was the accumulative physical toll of the life itself. The sleeping on wooden pillows to protect the hair, the lead in the makeup applied daily for years, the late hours and the early mornings and the physical demands of the work and the chronic low-level stress of living inside a system that owned your debt and monitored your movements. The body, which is very good at absorbing difficulty up to a point and then very suddenly not, absorbed all of it. The women of the Yoshiwara aged faster than their years, and the industry, which required youth, had limited compassion for what the industry itself had consumed. The Yoshiwara valued youth. It valued it the way a burning building values oxygen, completely, urgently, and without much concern for what happens when it runs out. A courtesan's earning years were finite, and everyone knew it, including her. The highest ranks were almost exclusively populated by women in their late teens and 20s. By the time a woman reached her 30s, and in the Yoshiwara, 30 felt different than 30 feels now. Her options had narrowed considerably. Some became managers or trainers, some worked in lower capacities within the same system, some left, if they could, and some stayed because leaving required money they didn't have, or a world outside the walls that had no particular use for a woman with their specific set of experiences. The trajectory was understood from the beginning, by everyone. The Kamuro watching her senior courtesan dress in the mornings knew, in some part of her mind, that what she was watching was time-limited. The oiran at the height of her reputation knew it too, which lent the whole enterprise a quality of impermanence that was, in the Yoshiwara's aesthetic framework, considered beautiful. Mono no aware, the bittersweet awareness of transience, was one of the organising emotional concepts of the Edo period, and nowhere was it more literally, more personally applicable than in the professional life of a woman whose value was explicitly attached to her age. A courtesan whose popularity was fading had options, and they were roughly in descending order of comfort. A woman with a loyal, wealthy client who wanted to keep her company could hope that client would eventually purchase her contract and establish her as a mistress, a concubine outside the walls, in a small house he maintained, no longer inside the Yoshiwara but attached to a man's household in a way that was economically precarious and socially ambiguous. It was better than the alternative. It was not what anyone would have chosen from a position of freedom. A woman who had accumulated real skill as a musician or dancer might transition into teaching those skills to younger women in the Yoshiwara or elsewhere. The district had a constant need for instructors, and a woman with genuine accomplishments had something to offer that was not attached to her youth. These women occupy an interesting position in the historical record, visible in the district's structure, important to its functioning, almost entirely absent from the woodblock prints and kabuki plays that immortalized the oiran at her peak. Some women became house managers, the okasan, the house mother, the woman who ran the daily operations of a smaller establishment, oversaw the newer women, handled the business logistics, and occupied a position of real authority within the Yoshiwara's internal structure. The okasan was not glamorous. She was not the subject of woodblock prints, but she had power in the specific, practical sense of being the person who made decisions about how things worked on a day-to-day basis. For a woman who had spent years having decisions made about her, that was not nothing. And some women simply declined with the system's indifference, moving down through the ranks as their youth receded, working in smaller establishments for less money with less choice, accumulating debt that the earning power to clear it had already passed. The Yoshiwara had a way of consuming the women who had made it run, thoroughly and without sentiment, and the district that had presented them at their most extraordinary during the years of their peak had very little ceremony for what came after. Edo burned. It burned spectacularly, repeatedly, and with what felt at times like genuine enthusiasm, earning the city the nickname the City of Fires, which is charming in retrospect and catastrophic in practice. The Yoshiwara was not immune. In 1657, the Mireki Fire, one of the most destructive urban fires in Japanese history, tore through the city and levelled the original Yoshiwara district, along with a significant portion of everything else. The shogunate, faced with the task of rebuilding the city, took the opportunity to relocate the Yoshiwara further from the centre. The new district, the Shin Yoshiwara, the new Yoshiwara, was rebuilt with improvements, a moat, new gates, a redesigned street layout. It was larger, it was more organised, and it was, in certain lights, more beautiful, which is either a silver lining or a particularly efficient way of papering over the structural problems. The Mireki Fire was, by any measure, an extraordinary catastrophe. It began in January and burned for 3 days, fueled by dry winter winds and the tightly packed wooden construction of Edo's neighbourhoods. Estimates suggest it killed between 50,000 and 100,000 people, a number that places it among the deadliest urban fires in world history. It destroyed roughly 2/3 of the city, including most of Edo Castle. The shogunate's response to the disaster was essentially to rebuild everything, larger and in some cases more deliberately planned than before. The original Yoshiwara had been located relatively close to the centre of the city, in an area called Nihonbashi. The Mireki fire gave the shogunate the opportunity they had perhaps already been looking for. The new Yoshiwara would be relocated to a marshy area on the northeastern edge of the city, in a district called Asakusa. It was further from the city centre, which served the shogunate's preference for keeping the floating world at a manageable distance. To get there from central Edo, you crossed a bridge called the Nihon Embankment, a causeway through rice paddies and wetlands that became, in the cultural imagination of the period, a kind of transitional zone, neither the city nor the Yoshiwara, a liminal passage between the ordinary world and the other one. The new Yoshiwara was designed with more deliberate care than the original. It was rectangular, surrounded by a moat, entered through a single large gate called the Omon. Inside, the main street ran straight through the centre, the Nakanocho, with establishments on either side and side streets branching off in a regular pattern. Cherry trees were eventually planted along the main thoroughfare, and the spring blossoming became one of Edo's major seasonal events, drawing visitors from across the city who came purely for the aesthetic experience of walking beneath the flowers at night, with lanterns lit on every side. Fire remained a constant threat throughout the Yoshiwara's existence. The district burned and rebuilt multiple times over its 3 centuries of operation. The wooden construction that made Edo's buildings beautiful also made them catastrophically flammable, and a district full of charcoal braziers, oil lamps, and incense burners was a district that required active vigilance against the thing that had already destroyed it once. The women who lived inside the walls were particularly vulnerable during fires, because the single gate entry point that made the Yoshiwara containable in administrative terms also made it containable in the literal sense when the buildings were burning. The historical record includes a number of Yoshiwara fires with significant casualties. The gate that kept the women in kept help out, and the math of that was not complicated. Once a year, something happened in the Yoshiwara that the rest of Edo would physically come out to watch. The oiran dochu, the grand procession of the highest-ranked courtesan through the main street of the district. She moved through it in those extraordinary platform shoes called komageta, thick-soled wooden platforms that could reach 30 centimetres in height, walking in a slow, figure-8 step that required years of practice and produced a visual effect that onlookers described, with some frequency, as otherworldly. Her attendants flanked her. Her junior courtesans followed. The crowd lined the street. The whole city's awareness narrowed to this one woman, moving slowly through lantern light, dressed in layered silk worth more than most people's annual income, her face an absolute mask of serene indifference. The oiran dochu was not, strictly speaking, a single annual event. It was the name for the style of procession that occurred whenever a top-ranked oiran moved publicly through the Nakanocho to receive a client at a tea house, a practice that happened regularly during the height of the district's social season. But the great seasonal processions, particularly in autumn and during the spring cherry blossom period, were the ones that drew the largest crowds and produced the images that woodblock print artists returned to obsessively, because the visual spectacle was simply extraordinary. The preparation for the procession began hours before it started. The oiran's dressing had to be complete, all 7 or more layers, the obi tied with exceptional care, the full assembly of kanzashi inserted into her hair, with the bira ornaments trembling at the slightest movement. Her face had to be perfect, the oshiroi applied flawlessly, the lips painted with the precision of a calligrapher, and then the shoes. The komageta required not just practice, but a specific physical technique. The toeing-in walk, placing each foot in a slow outward arc that kept the enormous platform shoes stable on the paved street, while creating the characteristic swaying movement that observers described as floating. She did not do this alone. The oiran was accompanied by a full retinue, her kamuro attendants on either side steadying her if needed, senior attendants carrying items, junior courtesans following at a respectful distance, sometimes musicians. The procession was a piece of theatre in which every participant had a specific role, and the hierarchy of the house was on public display. If the oiran was the lead performer, the retinue was the ensemble, and their precision and presentation reflected directly on the establishment they represented. The crowd that gathered to watch was genuine and large. People came from outside the Yoshiwara specifically to see the procession, standing along the Nakanocho in layers many people deep. For most onlookers, this was as close as they would ever get to the upper tiers of the Yoshiwara. The procession was free to watch, while everything inside the gate that mattered cost money. The Oiran Dochu was, in this sense, the Yoshiwara's public offering to the city that surrounded it, a glimpse of the extraordinary thing that existed behind the gate, carefully framed, presented at maximum visual impact, designed to generate both desire and awe. And the oiran herself, moving through all of this with her face entirely unreadable, her pace unhurried, her attention directed nowhere and everywhere simultaneously, she was performing the most demanding part of her professional repertoire. Total composure in the face of total exposure. The indifference had to be absolute, because anything less than absolute indifference looked like effort, and effort would have broken the spell entirely. Here is a thing that surprises people. Some of the most literate, most intellectually alive correspondence produced in Edo Japan came out of the Yoshiwara. Not all of it, not most of it, but some. The upper-tier courtesans were required to be able to write, really write, with proper calligraphy and a command of classical allusion, because the exchange of witty, poetic letters was part of the ritual of courtship that surrounded every serious client relationship. A woman who could write a devastating poem on a cold autumn morning, folded correctly and delivered with impeccable timing, was worth considerably more than one who couldn't. And so, some of them became genuinely good at it, in the same way a person forced to play an instrument for 6 hours a day might eventually discover they love music. The letter-writing culture of the Yoshiwara was elaborate and codified. After a successful visit, a client was expected to send a letter the following morning. The fumibako, or letterbox, was a standard piece of equipment in every establishment. The letter acknowledged the evening, expressed continued regard, and established the expectation of return. The courtesan was expected to reply, and the reply had to be good. Not merely adequate, not merely polite, genuinely good, clever, elusive, warm without being excessive, cool without being dismissive. The calibration required was fine enough that a poorly written reply could meaningfully damage a professional relationship. Calligraphy was part of the evaluation. The quality of the brushwork said something about the writer before the words were read. The pressure of the brush, the spacing of the characters, the overall aesthetic of the page. A letter written in beautiful calligraphy arrived with a kind of confidence. Even if the recipient couldn't read a word, he could see that the person who wrote it had spent years learning how to put ink on paper with intention. It was another layer in the performance of refinement, except that performing refinement for long enough, with enough repetition and genuine engagement, has a tendency to become actual refinement, which was both the intended outcome and an unintended complication. Some courtesans became genuinely known for their literary abilities. The Yoshiwara produced women whose poems circulated outside the district, whose letters were quoted in the kind of literary conversations that Edo period intellectuals had in tea-houses and academies. This was not the norm, but it happened with enough regularity to be recognized as a feature rather than an anomaly. The district that had been designed to provide physical companionship had accidentally created conditions for intellectual development, because the job required intelligence, and intelligence, given room and material, develops itself. The reading material available within the Yoshiwara included the popular fiction of the period, Sherbon and Kibyōshi, the illustrated comic books and witty novellas that circulated widely in Edo, and often featured the floating world as their primary setting. Some of this fiction was read with the particular attention of people who recognized themselves in the characters, which lends a quality to that reading experience that is hard to replicate and interesting to imagine. The Yoshiwara produced the culture it was depicted in, consumed the culture it inspired, and somewhere in that loop certain women found a life of the mind that the world outside the walls had not planned on giving them. Leaving the Yoshiwara was, in theory, possible. A woman's contract could be purchased by a client who wanted to make her his wife or mistress, by a family member who could scrape together the money, or in rare cases by the woman herself if she had managed to accumulate enough savings by means the house was not strictly supposed to allow. These buyouts happened. They are documented. They are also, in the historical record, notably less common than everyone inside the Yoshiwara was probably hoping they would be. The women who got out tended to go to one of two places: genuine domestic life with a man who had paid for the privilege of their company, or a kind of quiet limbo, free technically, but carrying a history that polite Edo society had very specific feelings about. The process of buying out a courtesan's contract was called muke, and it was a formal transaction with paperwork, negotiation, and a final sum that reflected the outstanding debt, plus whatever the house felt was appropriate compensation for losing a productive member of their establishment. The sum was not small. For a high-ranking oiran at the peak of her career, it could be enormous, the kind of money that required a wealthy man to liquidate other assets, call in favours, and occasionally make choices about his financial future that his family would have questions about later. For a lower-tier courtesan with a smaller debt and a less impressive earning history, the number was more manageable, which also meant the man willing to pay it was likely to be less wealthy, which shaped what her life looked like afterward. The man who performed the muke occupied an interesting social position. He was not marrying a courtesan in any formal sense. Marriage was a different institution with different requirements, and the social architecture of Edo had strong feelings about the mixing of categories. What he was doing was establishing her as his concubine, his mistress, the woman he kept in a small house he financed, separate from whatever official domestic arrangement he maintained elsewhere. This was entirely accepted, entirely documented, and entirely dependent on his continued goodwill for its financial sustainability. If he died, if he lost his money, if he simply changed his mind, her situation became precarious again with very little notice. Some of these arrangements were genuinely good. The historical record contains women who were bought out of the Yoshiwara by men who treated them well, established them comfortably, and maintained the relationship for decades. Some of these women became important figures in their patrons' lives, advisors, companions, women whose intelligence and cultural accomplishment were precisely what had made them attractive in the first place, and continued to make them valuable outside the walls. A courtesan who had spent years developing genuine skill in music, conversation, and the management of complicated social dynamics was not suddenly without those skills when she left the Yoshiwara. She just had a different venue. But the social stigma was real and persistent. A woman who had been in the Yoshiwara carried that fact with her into any subsequent life, and Edo society, which was meticulous about categories and highly resistant to people moving between them, never entirely forgot where she'd come from. Respectable women kept their distance. The wives of men who took former courtesans as mistresses were not, historically, enthusiastic about the arrangement. Children born to these unions occupied their own complicated social position. Freedom from the Yoshiwara was genuine freedom from its walls and its debt. It was not freedom from its memory. The women who managed to purchase their own freedom, saving carefully over years, from tips and gifts and small transactions the house chose not to monitor too closely, were the rarest category of all. They left with something more than the women who were bought out. They left with agency, with a decision that had been entirely their own. What they did with it varied enormously. Some disappeared into the city and made quiet lives. Some started their own establishments. Some, in a turn that the Yoshiwara's literature found deeply satisfying, became the okasan who managed the houses they had once been managed by. The system had a way of recycling its participants. The Yoshiwara did not simply exist within Edo's cultural life, it produced it. The great kabuki plays of the period, the love suicides, the desperate elopements, the tragic courtesans reaching for something just out of reach, were drawn almost entirely from the world behind the gates. The woodblock prints that define the aesthetic of the era, that you have seen on museum walls and tote bags and the sides of very self-conscious coffee shops, many of them depicted women of the Yoshiwara. These women were the celebrities of their age. Their faces sold products. Their hairstyles set trends that respectable women copied at a discreet remove. Their names were known across the city, and none of them, for the most part, saw much of that money. Kabuki theatre and the Yoshiwara grew up together, which is not a coincidence. Both emerged in the early Edo period as entertainment industries serving the same floating world audience, and both were subject to the same ambivalent official attention. Permitted because the alternative was worse, regulated because permission without regulation was unacceptable, watched carefully because the shogunate understood that culture shapes people and preferred to be involved in how. Women had been banned from kabuki performance since 1629, when the shogunate decided that female performers were too disruptive to public order, a decision that produced the onagata tradition of male actors specializing in female roles, which then became one of the most technically demanding and aesthetically refined traditions in Japanese theatre. The Yoshiwara and the Kabuki theatre district existed in adjacent spaces in the city's geography, and in continuous conversation in its cultural life, with actors visiting the Yoshiwara and courtesans providing the source material for the plays performed in the theatres. The woodblock prints are where the women of the Yoshiwara achieved a kind of immortality that was entirely disconnected from their actual experience. The bijinga, pictures of beautiful women, were a dominant genre of ukiyo-e, the woodblock print art of the floating world, and the women depicted were almost invariably courtesans or women associated with the entertainment districts. Artists like Kitagawa Utamaro produced images of Yoshiwara women that are still immediately recognizable: the elongated necks, the elaborate hairstyles, the specific quality of sideways gaze that seems to be looking at something slightly outside the frame. These images circulated widely, were collected by people who would never enter the Yoshiwara, and shaped the visual language of Edo beauty in ways that extended far beyond the district itself. What the prints did not show was the debt, the lead makeup, the wooden neck pillow, the illness, the contract. They showed the surface, the extraordinary, genuinely beautiful, painstakingly constructed surface, and the surface was compelling enough to sustain an entire art market. The courtesans depicted in these prints were, in a technical sense, the most reproduced female images of their era. Their faces were known to people across Japan in a way that no other women's faces were. They were famous in the particular modern sense of being recognized by people who had never met them and never would. Some women achieved a level of recognition that transcended the district. The names of celebrated oiran circulated through the city, the way celebrity names circulate now, in conversation, in print, in the theatre. When a particularly famous oiran died or retired or was bought out of her contract, it was news. People who had never visited the Yoshiwara knew who she was. Her style was imitated. Her name was attached to things. Shops sold accessories described as being in her preferred style. It was celebrity culture with Edo characteristics, the same basic mechanism of mass fascination, with a specific visible person, the same disconnection between the image that circulated and the experience of the actual human being at its centre. The artists who produced these images were not, for the most part, naive about the conditions they were depicting. Utamaro in particular produced work that occasionally gestured at the melancholy underneath the beauty, a woman's expression that was not quite right, a posture that suggested exhaustion beneath its elegance. Whether these were intentional commentaries or the inevitable bleed-through of reality into representation is a question art historians continue to find generative. What is clear is that the prints are both documents and constructions. They tell us what the Yoshiwara wanted to look like, which is not the same as what it was, and the gap between the two is where most of the history lives. The men who visited the Yoshiwara, particularly the ones who visited the upper tiers, tended to leave with a very specific set of stories they told themselves about what had just happened. The better ones knew it was a performance. The more thoughtful ones understood the economic structure and felt some version of unease about it. But a significant proportion went home having experienced what they interpreted as connection, real connection, the kind that comes when a skilled, trained, intelligent woman has spent several hours learning how to make a man feel uniquely seen and understood. It was one of the great confidence tricks of the Edo period, executed with extraordinary skill, and it worked so reliably that the city's entire theatrical culture was built around dramatizing the moment when a man forgot it was a trick at all. The Yoshiwara had its own literature of the male experience, and it is instructive. The Sharebon, witty social novels that circulated widely in Edo frequently used the Yoshiwara as their primary setting and the male visitor as their primary subject. These books were not romances, they were comedies of embarrassment. The genre had a recurring character, the man who arrived at the Yoshiwara thinking he understood how it worked and departed having demonstrated comprehensively that he did not. He overtipped at the wrong moment. He misread a signal. He confused professional warmth for personal feeling and made a declaration that the courtesan received with a composure that was itself the punchline. These books were extremely popular, which tells you that the readership recognized the character. They were laughing at themselves, which is either self-awareness or the next stage of the same delusion, and Edo period literature was too sophisticated to settle the question. The experienced visitor, the TSU, the connoisseur, the man who knew how the Yoshiwara worked and navigated it with appropriate detachment, was a figure of considerable cultural prestige in Edo. Being a TSU meant you understood the codes, appreciated the aesthetics, never embarrassed yourself or the courtesan, and maintained the correct emotional distance that allowed the whole system to function as theatre rather than collapsing into something messier. It was, in its way, an intellectual achievement, the ability to be fully present in an experience while maintaining the meta-awareness that the experience was a construction. Not everyone managed it. The Sharebon existed because not everyone managed it. What men took home, regardless of sophistication level, was the aesthetic. The Yoshiwara was the most concentrated expression of Edo visual and sensory culture available in a single location. The best music, the finest clothing, the most accomplished performers, all assembled in one lantern-lit district that operated as though beauty were the only value that mattered. Men who visited regularly absorbed this aesthetic and carried it back into their ordinary lives. The influence of Yoshiwara taste on Edo fashion, on interior design, on the kinds of music that became popular in domestic settings, all of it filtered outward from the district into the broader culture. The men were, among other things, aesthetic transmission vectors. They went to the Yoshiwara and came home changed in small ways that accumulated across generations into something that shaped the entire visual culture of the period. What very few of them took home was any serious consideration of the experience from the other side. The literature of male visitors to the Yoshiwara is extensive. The literature of women's interior experience of the same encounters is sparse. which is one of the structural features of a system designed to produce a specific kind of visibility for women and a specific kind of invisibility for everything that visibility concealed. The men went home with their stories. The women stayed inside the walls with theirs. And the two sets of stories were so different that they might have been describing separate worlds, which in many ways they were. The mythology the men constructed was not malicious for the most part. It was simply the natural result of a system designed to produce a particular experience and then frame that experience in ways that made it sustainable. You were meant to leave feeling that the evening had been real. You were meant to believe at some level that the warmth directed at you had been specifically for you. The system worked best when the mythology was intact. And the mythology was intact for most men, most of the time, which is why the system ran for 250 years and generated a cultural output that is still filling museum rooms and academic papers, and apparently late-night YouTube channels in the present day. In 1703, a playwright named Chikamatsu Monzemon wrote a puppet play called The Love Suicides at Sonozaki, based on an actual double suicide that had occurred between a merchant's apprentice and a courtesan just a month before. It was a sensation, and then it was followed by more. The love suicide, shinju, became a genre, a phenomenon, a cultural obsession. Two people, trapped by debt and contract and the rigid social architecture of Edo society, choosing death over separation. The plays were banned, eventually, because the government noticed that people were reenacting them in real life with some regularity. But the ban barely slowed the mythology down, because the mythology was pointing at something true. The Yoshiwara created conditions in which real feeling and impossible circumstance collided with enormous force, and sometimes people didn't survive the collision. Chikamatsu has been called the Shakespeare of Japan, which is the kind of comparison that flattens both writers, but gestures at something real. He was a dramatist of extraordinary psychological precision, working at the moment when his culture's emotional contradictions were at maximum pressure, and he had the skill to turn those contradictions into theatre that made audiences recognise themselves. The love suicides at Sonozaki ran for years. It produced imitators. It produced a genre. And the genre produced a cultural conversation about what love meant inside a society that had made love structurally impossible for most of the people most likely to feel it. The mechanics of the Shinju narrative were consistent enough to be called a formula, except that formulas don't usually make people cry, and these did. A man, typically a merchant's apprentice or a junior tradesman, someone with moderate means and real feelings, becomes attached to a courtesan. The attachment is genuine on both sides, or at least the plays treat it as genuine, which is its own interesting choice. But his money is insufficient to buy out her contract. His social position makes formal marriage impossible even if the money were available. Her debt is real and growing. His rivals for her attention have deeper pockets. Every avenue toward a life together is closed by the specific combination of debt, contract, class, and the rigid social architecture of the Tokugawa period. And so, having exhausted every option, they choose the only one that remains, to die together, in the belief that a love that cannot be completed in this life can be fulfilled in the next. The theology underpinning this was genuine. Buddhist concepts of karma and rebirth gave the Shinju its philosophical scaffolding. The idea that a bond formed in one life carries forward, that what cannot be resolved now will be resolved in a future existence. The lovers in these plays were not despairing. They were, in a specific sense, hopeful. They were making a bet on continuity, on the idea that love was real enough and durable enough to survive death and find its completion in another form. It was devastating, and it was, within its own framework, entirely logical. The plays made you feel both the tragedy and the logic simultaneously, which is why they were unbearable to watch and impossible to stop watching. The shogunate banned the plays in 1722 specifically because the Shinju narrative had moved out of the puppet theatre and into real life with alarming frequency. The term shinju had become attached to real deaths. Couples found dead together, their arrangements suggesting that they had read the plays or seen them performed and had taken the conclusion as a template. Banning the plays did not eliminate the phenomenon, but it changed how it could be discussed publicly. The puppet theatre found ways to continue exploring the same themes with adjusted framing, because the themes were not going away just because the government found them inconvenient. What the Shinju plays were really doing, underneath the love story, underneath the theology, underneath the theatrical spectacle of two people walking toward death in the pre-dawn darkness of Osaka or Edo, was a structural critique. They were showing, with unflinching clarity, what the social architecture of the Edo period actually did to people. The debt system that kept women inside the Yoshiwara was not an abstraction. The class system that prevented a merchant's apprentice from marrying above his station was not a background detail. These were the specific mechanisms by which the tragedy was produced, and the plays named them. Not loudly, not polemically, Chikamatsu was not writing pamphlets. But the logic of the narrative made the logic of the system visible, and audiences watching these plays understood, at some level, that they were watching a drama that the world they lived in had written. The legacy of the Shinju plays extended far beyond the Edo period. They influenced the development of Japanese theatre, Japanese literature, and the Japanese cultural treatment of love as something that exists in fundamental tension with social obligation, a tension that did not resolve with the Meiji Restoration or with modernity, and that continues to surface in Japanese fiction and film in ways that are recognizably descended from the world Chikamatsu was dramatizing. The Yoshiwara produced many things. The Shinju plays may be the most enduring, not a celebration of the district, not a condemnation of it, but a precise and heartbreaking account of what it cost the people who lived inside its logic. The Yoshiwara outlasted the Edo period. When the Meiji Restoration arrived in 1868, and Japan began its rapid, disorienting transformation into a modern industrialized nation, the district did not simply close. It adapted, changed, was officially renamed, was officially regulated in new ways, continued operating under a different legal fiction. It was not until 1958 that licensed prostitution was formally abolished in Japan, ending a system that had, in various forms, been running for over 3 centuries. The women who had worked inside it across all those generations, the oiran, and the lowest-tier workers and everyone in between, had left behind an enormous cultural footprint. In art, in theatre, in music, in the entire aesthetic vocabulary of the Edo period. What they had left behind of themselves was considerably quieter and considerably harder to find. The Meiji Restoration was, among many other things, a crisis of identity for every institution the Tokugawa shogunate had built or permitted. The new government looked at Japan through the lens of how it appeared to Western eyes, because Western eyes were suddenly everywhere, and Western approval was suddenly a political priority, and the Yoshiwara presented a problem. It was not the kind of institution that featured prominently in the version of Japan the Meiji government wanted to present to the international community. It was visible, it was large, it was 3 centuries old, and it was very difficult to explain without also explaining the entire social architecture that had produced it, which required explaining things the new government preferred to move past quickly. The official response was the Prostitution Emancipation Act of 1872, which declared that licensed prostitutes were free, that their contracts were no longer legally enforceable, and that they could leave if they chose. This sounds more transformative than it was. A woman whose debt was legally unenforceable was still a woman with a debt, still a woman inside a walled district, still a woman with nowhere obvious to go and no obvious means of supporting herself if she left. The legal fiction of emancipation and the practical reality of continued operation existed side by side for decades, which is one of the Meiji period's recurring features. The formal announcement of a new order and the continued functioning of the old one underneath it. The district continued. The names changed. The oiran, as a specific cultural category, faded. The elaborate ceremonial courtesanship of the Edo period was too expensive, too time-consuming, and too aesthetically specific to survive the acceleration of the Meiji era, which had less patience for 2-hour dressing rituals and 3-visit minimums. What replaced it was more straightforwardly commercial and less elaborately theatrical, which was in some ways more honest, and in some ways represented the loss of something that had been, whatever else it was, genuinely extraordinary. The shamisen was still played, the lanterns were still lit, but the procession of the oiran, that extraordinary slow walk through lantern light in platform shoes, was already becoming a historical memory rather than a living practice. The Great Kanto earthquake of 1923 destroyed large portions of the district, as it destroyed large portions of Tokyo. The rebuilding after the earthquake produced a Yoshiwara that was physically different from what had come before, less wooden, more modern in construction, shaped by the same forces of rapid modernization that were reshaping the city around it. The Second World War brought further disruption. The firebombing of Tokyo in 1945 destroyed the district again, more thoroughly than any previous fire, in a conflagration that made the Mireki fire of 1657 look contained by comparison. The post-war Yoshiwara that emerged from the rubble was operating in a completely different Japan, occupied, reconstructed, confronting the question of what it was and wanted to be with an urgency that had no historical precedent. The Prostitution Prevention Law of 1958 finally ended licensed prostitution in Japan, closing the legal framework that had, in various forms, sustained the Yoshiwara and districts like it for over 3 centuries. The date is precise, the ending was not. The buildings did not disappear overnight. The social conditions that had filled them did not resolve themselves because a law had been passed. What the law did was remove the official sanction, the regulated structure, the government's explicit permission for the system to operate as a system. What remained after that was the geography, the history, and the question of what to do with both. Today, the neighborhood of Asakusa in Tokyo sits where the Yoshiwara once operated. It is a busy, popular district. Tourists visit its temples and its markets, its street food, and its traditional craft shops. The physical traces of the Yoshiwara are largely gone, absorbed into the modern city with the efficiency that Tokyo applies to its own history. There is a small museum. There are historical markers. There is, in certain corners of the neighborhood, an awareness that the ground you're standing on has a long story, though the story is not always the one prominently advertised. What remains more durably is the cultural inheritance. The woodblock prints are in museums around the world. The kabuki plays derived from Yoshiwara source material are still performed. The shamisen music that filled the district's evenings is still taught and played. The aesthetic vocabulary of the floating world, the specific combination of melancholy and beauty, the awareness of transience, the elevation of the present moment, because the present moment is all that can be relied upon, is woven into Japanese cultural expression in ways that do not require the Yoshiwara to still exist in order to persist. And the women. 3 centuries of women, most of them nameless in the historical record, present in the woodblock prints and absent from the ledgers in any way that captures what they actually experienced. The oiran whose procession stopped traffic, the kamuro learning to dress by watching her senior, the woman calculating her debt by lamplight at the end of an evening, the courtesan who wrote a poem that circulated outside the walls and was quoted by people who never knew where it came from. They are the centre of the story, and the hardest part of it to see clearly, because the system that produced the visual record was the same system that had reasons to show certain things and conceal others. What we can say, with the certainty that 3 centuries of evidence provides, is that they were there. That they were people, complicated, resilient, sometimes funny, sometimes furious, sometimes genuinely gifted, always navigating inside a structure that had been built around them rather than for them. The Yoshiwara is over. The story of the women inside it is the kind that does not entirely end just because the institution does. It continues in the questions it generates, in the art it produced, in the persistent human need to look at what was built and ask, clearly and without sentimentality, what it cost and who paid. The Yoshiwara had its own language, not a completely separate tongue, not something unintelligible to an ordinary Edo resident, but a distinct dialect, a set of vocabulary, speech patterns, and linguistic conventions that mark the speaker as belonging to the district, in the same way that the front-tied obi and the elaborate hairstyle mark the body. It was called Kuruwa Kotoba, the language of the enclosure, and it functions simultaneously as professional tool, social signal, and cultural identity. If you walked into the Yoshiwara and opened your mouth, what came out told everyone in the room exactly who you were, where you were from, and how much you understood about where you'd just arrived. The origins of Kuruwa Kotoba were practical before they were aesthetic. The Yoshiwara drew women from across Japan, from Kyoto and Osaka and the rural provinces, from places whose regional dialects were immediately identifiable to any Edo resident, and carried with them associations of class, origin, and social position that the district's upper tiers needed to manage carefully. A courtesan whose speech immediately identified her as a peasant girl from a northern province was working against the image of refinement that the upper Yoshiwara sold. So the dialect was, in part, a levelling mechanism, a shared speech that replaced whatever a woman had arrived with and gave her a new linguistic identity that belonged to the district rather than to her origins. You came in speaking one way and left speaking another, and the transition was not framed as an erasure. It was framed as an education. Kuruwa Kotoba was soft where standard Edo speech was sharp. Certain consonants were smoothed. Certain vowels were lengthened into something that carried warmth at its edges. The rhythm of the speech was slower, more deliberate, constructed to feel attentive, as though the speaker had nowhere else to be and no one else she would rather be talking to. This was, of course, a professional technique, but technique repeated daily for years has a way of becoming habit, and habit has a way of becoming character, and there is a question buried in the history of Kuruwa Kotoba about where the performance ended and the person began that the historical record is not equipped to answer. The specific vocabulary was extensive. The Yoshiwara had its own words for ordinary things, for clients, for the different categories of engagement, for the various stages of the evening's ritual, for the emotional states that the professional context produced and required responses to. Some of these words were euphemistic, doing the work that all professional euphemism does, making the transaction more comfortable by wrapping it in language that emphasized its ceremonial and aesthetic dimensions rather than its commercial ones. Some were simply practical, shorthand that the women used with each other, efficient terms for things that needed to be communicated quickly and quietly in the margins of a busy evening. The dialect also had a grammar of indirection that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Direct statements were rare in Kuruwa Kotoba. Feelings were expressed obliquely. Refusals were communicated through implication rather than declaration. This indirection was partly aesthetic. The floating world valued the suggested over the stated, the almost said over the explicit, and partly practical, because a woman who needed to communicate something to a colleague without the client understanding had to be able to do so in language that sounded, to the uninitiated ear, like ordinary conversation. Kuruwa Kotoba gave its speakers a middle register, a layer between the performance and the private, that was theirs in a system that had claimed almost everything else. The clients, or at least the sophisticated ones who considered themselves connoisseurs of the floating world, made efforts to learn the dialect. Speaking Kurua Kotoba as a visitor was a mark of cultural literacy. It demonstrated that you had spent enough time in the district to absorb its customs, that you understood what you were participating in at a level beyond the transactional. These men were, in a sense, doing what people always do when they encounter a culture they find compelling. They adopted its language as a way of belonging to it, or at least of appearing to. The women who heard a client attempt Kurua Kotoba evaluated the attempt with the expertise of native speakers listening to a foreign accent, noting what was correct, what was almost correct, and what revealed. Despite the effort, exactly how outside the district the speaker actually was. The language that was meant to dissolve the boundary between client and courtesan was also the thing that made the boundary most visible, which is, when you think about it, a very Yoshiwara outcome. Let's talk about food, because the Yoshiwara ate well, considerably better than most of Edo, and in ways that reveal something important about what the district was and how it understood itself. The floating world ran on pleasure, and pleasure in the Edo period was understood to be multisensory. The music and the clothing and the conversation were accompanied by food and drink of genuine quality, served with the same attention to aesthetic presentation that characterized everything else in the upper tiers of the district. A client arriving for an important evening was not handed a bowl of rice and pointed toward a corner. He was fed, carefully and elaborately, in a context where the food was part of the experience and the experience was the product. The machiai tea houses that lined the Nakanocho were the first point of contact for most visitors of consequence, and they were real culinary establishments with real reputations. A tea house that served mediocre food lost business to one that served good food, which is the most ordinary market mechanism in the world, and also the one that produced, in the Yoshiwara context, a genuine culture of culinary quality. The tea houses competed on taste, on presentation, on the quality of their sake selection, on the skill of their kitchen staff. This competition benefited everyone who ate there, which included the women of the district, whose meals came from the same kitchens that fed the clients, or from establishments that operated in the same competitive environment. Sake was not simply alcohol in the Yoshiwara context, it was ceremony. The manner of its service carried meaning that the content of the cup did not. A courtesan pouring sake for a client was enacting a specific social ritual with its own conventions. The angle of the pour, the attention given to the client's cup before her own, the particular quality of focus directed at the act of service that made the service feel personal rather than professional. The sake itself was poured into lacquered cups that caught the lamplight, and the visual dimension of the service, the gleam of the liquid, the warmth of the lacquer, the deliberateness of the gesture, was part of what was being offered. You were not being given a drink. You were being given an experience in which a drink was the vehicle. The food that accompanied formal evenings drew heavily on the kaiseki tradition, the multi-course meal style associated with the tea ceremony, in which small, carefully prepared dishes were served in a sequence that honoured the season and demonstrated the kitchen's skill. Each dish was presented in vessels chosen to complement it, ceramics, whose glazes harmonised with the colour of the food, lacquerware whose finish suited the occasion. The aesthetic of the meal was inseparable from its content, which meant that eating in the upper Yoshiwara was a continuous exercise in the appreciation of things that had been made deliberately beautiful, which was also the experience of everything else in the district and was, cumulatively, either deeply satisfying or quietly exhausting, depending on your relationship to deliberate beauty. The street food available in the Yoshiwara's more accessible areas was a different register entirely. The soba noodles and the grilled skewers and the sweet bean cakes that Edo street food culture had perfected and that were available at small stalls along the district's side streets. These existed for clients of more modest means, for the staff of the various establishments, and for the women themselves at those hours when the evening ceremony was over, and what was wanted was something simple and hot and requiring no aesthetic appreciation whatsoever. The contrast between the kaiseki meal served on lacquerware to a high-paying client and the bowl of soba eaten quickly at a side street stall in the quiet of the early morning is a small illustration of the Yoshiwara's larger structure. Extraordinary beauty at the centre, ordinary human need at the edges, and a great deal of careful management of the distance between the two. The morning meal occupied its own ritual space. After a client had stayed through the night, an arrangement that carried its own protocol and its own additional expense, the morning brought a meal that was deliberately simple: rice, miso soup, pickled vegetables, the clean flavours of a Japanese breakfast that functioned as a kind of palate cleanser after the richness of the evening. The simplicity was not poverty. It was a choice, an aesthetic decision to end the encounter in a register of quiet domesticity that provided a specific emotional landing after the elaborate performance of the night before. Whether the women who prepared and ate these mornings found them peaceful or merely functional is another of those questions the historical record declines to answer directly. But the food was good, the ingredients were fresh, and in a life that offered limited choices, a well-made breakfast in the early light was a pleasure that belonged to no one's ledger. The Yoshiwara had its own relationship with time, not the agricultural time of the rice paddy, or the administrative time of the shogunate's edicts, but the time of pleasure, which ran on a different clock and marked its passages with different ceremonies. The district celebrated the same seasonal festivals as the rest of Edo, but it celebrated them with a particular intensity and a particular aesthetic ambition, because in the floating world every occasion was an opportunity for display, and display was both the product and the point. The calendar of the Yoshiwara was a sequence of deliberate beauties, each one framed and lit and dressed to maximum effect, and the women at the centre of those beauties wore the seasons on their bodies the way other people wore them in their gardens. Spring arrived in the Yoshiwara with the cherry blossoms, and the cherry blossoms arrived like a standing ovation that the district had been waiting for all winter. The trees along the Nakanocho had been planted with intention. Someone early in the district's history understood that placing cherry trees along the main street of a place, built on the philosophy of beautiful impermanence, was not subtlety, but it was correctness, and correctness served. During the blossom season, the trees were hung with additional lanterns so that the illumination from below met the pale pink overhead and produced a quality of light that observers across multiple centuries described with the same vocabulary: dreamlike, otherworldly, difficult to believe was real. The effect was not accidental. It had been engineered with the same deliberate care that the Yoshiwara applied to every other element of its presentation, down to the angle of the lanterns and the timing of their lighting relative to dusk. The cherry blossom season was also the Yoshiwara's busiest and most commercially significant period. The combination of the flowers, the light, the music drifting through the district screens, and the awareness that the blossoms would be gone within 2 weeks produced in visitors a heightened state of attention and spending that the district's establishments understood very well and prepared for accordingly. The women wore their spring kimono, pale colours, flower motifs, the specific fabrics associated with the warming season, and the whole district operated at maximum aesthetic intensity for the duration of the blossoms. When the petals fell, they fell onto the paved street of the Nakanocho, in drifts that people walked through without clearing, because the fallen petals were the point as much as the flowers had been. Beauty in the act of ending was beauty at its most Yoshiwara. Summer brought heat and the obon season, the period of the floating lanterns and the honouring of the dead, and the Yoshiwara observed it with a quality of feeling that was not entirely ceremonial. The moat surrounding the district was used for the lantern floating that accompanied Obon, small paper lanterns set on the water and released to drift in the darkness, each one carrying an intention, or a memory, or a name. For women who had lost colleagues to illness, who had watched the system consume people they had known since their Komuro years, who carried their own inventory of losses accumulated inside the walls, the Obon lanterns on the moat had a specific gravity that the same ceremony performed elsewhere in Edo may not have carried. The dead were remembered. The lanterns moved slowly on the water. The shamisen music in the evenings during Obon had a different quality, slower and more minor, and the women who played it were playing something that was also for themselves. Autumn was the season of the chrysanthemum, and the Yoshiwara decorated with a seriousness that reflected the flower's cultural weight. Chrysanthemums in the Edo period were not casual garden flowers. They were the imperial flower, associated with longevity, with the passage of time, with a particular kind of beauty that requires patience to produce. Arranging them correctly, in the right vessels with the right complementary materials, was a skill that the better establishments employed specifically skilled people to perform. The women changed into autumn kimono, deeper colours now, the summer's pale clarity replaced by the season's richness, the russets and golds and the particular deep purple that autumn in the floating world required. Clients came in autumn for a different version of the experience than spring offered. Where spring was about arrival and opening, autumn was about fullness and impending loss, and the Yoshiwara's emotional register shifted accordingly. Winter was the season that the Yoshiwara's aesthetic struggled with most honestly. The cold was real, and the buildings were not insulated, and the silk kimono, however many layers were worn, was not the same as being warm. The charcoal braziers, the hibachi that provided the primary heating in the district's rooms, produced a localized warmth that required you to be sitting close to them to benefit from, and moving away from them into the cold air of a wooden corridor at 2 a.m. was the kind of physical experience that no amount of aesthetic framing made comfortable. But winter had its ceremonies too. The year-end cleaning, the New Year preparations, the pine and bamboo kadomatsu decorations placed outside every establishment. The first clients of the new year received with a specific formality that the rest of the year's encounters did not require. The New Year in the Yoshiwara was its own extended performance. The women dressed in their most formal winter kimono, the houses were decorated with the full apparatus of New Year symbolism, and the first days of the New Year were treated as a period of heightened ceremony in which every interaction carried the additional weight of beginning, the beginning of a new year, a new count, a new set of possibilities. Whether those possibilities were real or symbolic depended on your position in the district's hierarchy and the state of your debt ledger, neither of which the New Year ceremony addressed. But the ceremony was observed, and observed beautifully, because the Yoshiwara's relationship to its ceremonies was one of the few things inside the walls that was not entirely determined by the economics of the institution. The seasons came regardless of the ledgers. The cherry blossoms bloomed regardless of the contracts, and the women who dressed in spring colours and floated lanterns on the summer water and arranged chrysanthemums in autumn vessels were doing something that belonged to the calendar and to the human need to mark time's passage with intention, something that the system could frame and display and profit from, but could not entirely own. And so here we are, at the end of a very long walk through lantern-lit streets that no longer exist, in a city that has rebuilt itself so many times over that the ground beneath modern Tokyo has forgotten or pretended to forget what it once held. You have spent this evening with the women of the Yoshiwara, not the woodblock print version, not the impossibly composed figure in 7 layers of silk, her face a perfect white mask, her expression unreadable, her platform shoes elevating her above the ordinary world. The real version. The girl who arrived with a debt that preceded her. The Kamuro learning to walk correctly in clothing that weighed more than she did. The courtesan practicing the shamisen for the 4th hour in a row because imperfect was not acceptable, and acceptable was not enough. The woman calculating quietly by lamplight whether the number in the ledger had moved in her direction today. It usually hadn't. These were people. Complicated, resourceful, sometimes funny, sometimes exhausted, occasionally extraordinary people, navigating one of the most precisely engineered systems of constraint ever built around a human being, using whatever tools the system had accidentally left within reach. Some of them wrote poetry that outlasted the walls they were written inside. Some of them played music that became part of the sound of an entire civilization. Some of them moved through a room with a quality of presence that the men who witnessed it spent the rest of their lives trying to describe and never quite managed. None of them chose it. That is the thing to carry with you into sleep tonight. Not the beauty, which was real, but the fact that the beauty was not chosen. It was produced under conditions that the people producing it did not design and could not leave. And yet the beauty was real. The music was real. The poems were real. The moments of genuine connection, complicated and commercially entangled as they were, happened between real people in real rooms and mattered to the people they happened to. History is rarely clean. The Yoshiwara is not a story with a villain and a lesson and a tidy resolution. It is a story about what people make inside impossible circumstances, which is the oldest story there is, and the one that keeps being true regardless of the century or the city or the specific architecture of the constraint. So tonight, as you settle into whatever softness your bed offers, and it is almost certainly softer than a wooden neck pillow designed to preserve a hairstyle that took 2 hours to assemble, maybe hold a quiet thought for the women who lit those lanterns, who wore those seasons on their bodies, who played that aching shamisen music into the Edo night while the cherry blossoms fell on the street outside and the city moved around them, and the debt sat in the ledger and the morning was still several hours away. They were there, they were real. The floating world floated on them, and they held it up, and they deserved to be remembered as more than the surface of a woodblock print. Let the shamisen play you down now. Let the lanterns dim one by one along the Nakanocho. Let the cherry blossoms drift. Let Edo go quiet the way it went quiet in the early hours, when even the floating world needed to rest. You're safe. You're warm. The debt is not yours. Good night.